Okay? All right. So somebody who are tuning in from last week will be surprised to note that we're starting where we started last week. Actually, last week was a kind of discussion, exploration of a theme that came up in the passages before the verses, and now tonight we'll go right into the verses. I'm on page 58, 59 of my digital text, and the verses we're looking at start with Guang De Ku Heng Jie Shu Xi Ye Jing Xin Wu Yan Dai Yi Du Nan Du Shi Zi Hou Pu Wa Zhong Sheng Shi Qi Xing. And roughly the translation would be, he cultivates all profuse and great bitter practices vigorously throughout the day and night without weariness or fatigue. He's already rescued those who are difficult to rescue by means of his lion's roar, because universally transforming living beings is his practice. So last week we noted, but I want to mention again that this is a very active, engaged Buddha. Most people think of Buddhas as retired or into a final nirvana, but in the Avatamsaka, according to these verses, the Buddha is very active, and you can see that from the last line, universally, meaning everywhere, and not just everywhere, but throughout all time, continuing. Transforming living beings is what they practice. It's an actual activity, which, by my standard would suggest an immediate and deep engagement with the world. And not just our world, but when it says living beings, it means beings throughout the 10 Dharma realms, particularly the 6 paths. And then you see in the first line, without weariness or fatigue, again, it is something that is done without weariness or fatigue, we'll talk about that. But also it's associated with a training regimen, if you can look at the first line, cultivated the profuse and great bitter practices. This idea of cultivating the way, which is cultivating oneself, has to do with a disciplining, a training of body, speech, and mind. And there's different ways to do this. Speech is sometimes, these 3 karmas of body, speech, and mind are covered under the 10 goods. 3 relating to the mind, 3 relating to the body, and 4 relating to the mouth. But they're about getting a handle on one's activities, one's intentional actions of body, speech, and thought. That regulation, that taming and subduing of that energy of one's person creates a sort of dharma vessel, if you will, a vajra, body and mind and spirit, that's able to enter and also receive and transmit the way, the Dharma. And just as athletes train for performances in high-end sports or the Olympics, cultivators train themselves. And these bitter practices are referring to the Dhutanga practices. Sometimes people know them as Tudong. It's a list of 13 practices. And they're observed throughout the traditions. You see this in the Thai forest tradition, often wandering monks, less so nuns, but even wandering nuns, who live a life of training. And by the training, it involves sometimes these 13 Dhutanga practices. Sometimes they're called ascetic practices or austerities. And they're meant to sort of deepen self-understanding and self-control. So the purpose of them is, one, to find contentment with little and not always needing more. To be able to find contentment. Now, little doesn't mean deficient, it just means enough. So it doesn't mean deficiency, because deficiency would then be hard to find contentment because you'd be on the other extreme. So too much and too little. So, but it's surprising how little one needs when you really get down to it, and how much of what we have and buy and consume or want is extraneous or even excessive. So it's to practice a sort of contentment with little. It's also to then, related to that, to cultivate moderation. So even in the eating, where I'll mention one of these is to eat one meal a day, but even there you don't stuff yourself like a Thanksgiving turkey and think, okay, if I stuff myself now, then I'll be able to make it through the rest of the day. But rather you get to something like 85% full. So you never really go beyond moderation. The other aspect of the Dhutanga, called the bitter, and I want to challenge that word, is a kind of detachment, especially from material things. Now you could say detachment, or a better translation might be freedom from. The people that take this up don't necessarily experience them as austerities and bitterness. This is a kind of gloss that's put on the top of them, but actually many people, when they practice these, feel them as beneficial practices, and they feel them as liberating rather than austerities or renunciations. In fact, they go from an experience of being sort of drunk and heavy with things, thoughts, material things, and so when these are moderated or brought into just enough, the corresponding feeling isn't one of bitter renunciation, but a kind of a sweet release from. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling where you have too much, and just lightening your load and getting rid of it brings a liberating release rather than a sense of loss or deprivation. So I think one has to look at these, as they're viewed from the outside, they're looked as austerities and bitter practices. But the actual existential experience of them can be quite different. This was the case with me. When I first started practicing these, I didn't feel them as oppressive or a kind of bitterness, but rather a lightness of being. Anyhow, so we have a certain detachment that comes, a certain moderation, a contentment, a satisfaction with little or enough, I want to translate. And then finally, the other purpose they're done for is for energy. They really raise up the vigor, especially some of these. So when the one particularly of sleeping sitting up, It's primarily done to raise energy, to raise vigor. Now, these, by the way, I want to mention, are voluntarily taken up. Yeah, so, you know, for next Friday night, anybody wants to come, you have to do these 13 now. They're voluntarily taken up, and the Buddha, in cases, recommended them to be voluntarily taken up, and then monitored his disciples while they were doing this, because even though somebody might have wanted to take this up, the Buddha or one of the arhats would have said, nah, you're not ready for this. You have to have a certain prerequisite to take any of these up. And more importantly, the motivation with which you take them up is also critical to the outcome. So it's not as simple as you just dive into these practices and then take them up without a proper attitude of those 4 things I mentioned: aiming at moderation, finding content with few things, raising your energy, and sort of breaking attachment to things. If they're done with the idea of getting sort of supernatural powers or to impress somebody else, the intentionality, cetana, is off. And so a potentially good Dharma practice becomes distorted and not so wholesome because the intention spoils it. And that's true of any practice: meditation, bowing, recitation, memorization. Go through the list of the 84,000 Dharma doors. Cetana, intentionality, is the key. So you have to have proper intention. And then things can be efficacious. Otherwise, they turn around and bite you. And these things then become really bitter. They don't become liberating. So let me just go through some of them. And just for the sake of interest tonight, I was just trying to think if that's what I wanted to, yeah. I mean, there's so many things I could stress in this, but let's look at that one. Do you know, have we done this before? Looked at the 13? Okay. This is not one of them. So, depending on where you come from, see, that's green tea, very light green tea. In places tonight, that would be considered bitter, a bitter practice. There's people out there that are drinking a lot of other things. And so relative to, but for me, this is like a nice indulgence, a warm cup of green tea on a cold night. But for somebody else, it's like, oh, I couldn't do that. That's so bitter. Okay, anyhow, the first one is you take robes that have been abandoned. You don't just get new robes. So you'll often see the famous picture of Shu Yin where he has patches. It's basically a patched robe. What he's done is just taken robes that have been thrown away or almost worn out and take the patches that are still good and sew them together. So only one robe patch. The other one is only 3 robes. So traditionally, this is represented by the 3 precept sashes that monks in this tradition have, which is a 5-piece, a 7-piece, and then a 9-piece, and sometimes a great red robe. But again, it's reducing clothing. So if you're a layperson, you're thinking, yeah, I've only got 3 bathrobes. No, my silk one, my plush. No, that's not what it means. These robes are talking about your basic clothing. So try to get within, if you're going to do this as a non-monastic, don't throw away things so quickly. Sew them up. I've got a wonderful rug in my bathroom that I've kept for years. It still works to dry my wetness when I get out. It was made by my mother back in the 1950s. She took all the old things of the clothes from dresses of my sisters and crocheted them into this rug. And it's still holding up. And so I remember her. I remember the frugality and austerity of someone who came through the Depression, didn't throw things away and so forth. I could go to Bed Bath & Beyond and get some nice new one, but I like to keep this one. And it keeps people from spending less time on my bathroom because it's not pretty. So what it's saying here, though, is instead of throwing your clothes away, see if you can salvage them. See if you can sew it up, not just get rid of it. And also, at the front load end of this, don't buy so much. I mean, so much of our buying is driven by a sort of anxious insecurity or greed or nervousness, but not actually from need. And I include myself in this. Every time I open a drawer or a closet in my house, I say, oh, wow, that's too much. It's too much. And then I get rid of it. A couple weeks later, here I am at Costco. And I pick up again. So this is a constant struggle, but you can see how it's struggling with the mind that always wants and craves and feels inadequate, and that's what you're cornering with these practices. So by holding these practices, you're actually wrestling with it. Do you actually defeat it? I don't know, maybe. Sometimes you defeat it, and then it bites you again, and you defeat it. But it's a kind of cultivation. That's the third one is then for the monks was begging for going on alms rounds. And you only eat bindabat, what you get from the alms round. Now this is not per se begging, because this is considered to be giving other people the opportunity to make offerings. And so the bowl that you carry when you go out is called the Field of Blessings bowl. It's a field in which people plant blessings by giving. This is understood in the Buddhist tradition. In America, this was less understood, so when Heng Sure and I were on our bowing pilgrimage, we'd often hear, "Get a job, man, you bums, you're begging." And in fact, we didn't. We never went on alms rounds. We just, if people brought food, we ate. If they didn't bring food, we kind of made do with whatever we had, but we never actively did that. One of the reasons then was because we wanted to really keep a focused concentration practice, and also it wasn't understood. And we would have, in some places, been thrown in jail for solicitation. So anyhow, so that's the third one. The fourth one is to go on a regular alms round and go from house to house. And not, special houses or special areas. So you just go regular in sequence to a neighborhood. Rich neighborhood, poor neighborhood, you don't distinguish that. Now again, this sort of has to do with sort of eating habits, sort of high-end gourmet, sort of takeout. I got a place here I go where I get takeout. Simple, vegetarian food. I like supporting the people who have the restaurant instead of going to Michelin stars. Okay, so it's sort of like every once in a while you want to go to a Michelin star, fine. But if your mind is always a Michelin star mentality, then you're kind of defeating this idea of just eating regularly, simple food. Now this one is particularly for advanced practice where you're eating, that's only one meal a day. Which some people take up. And again, these are the ones where you have to be careful on your age and your health, on your vitality. It's easier when you're younger to do this, much harder when you're older. So often in the monasteries you'll see monks and nuns who are old like me, in their 60s or 70s, where they reduce this practice. They might have been doing it for all their lives, and then they start to take a little food in the morning. And basically it's taken as a kind of medicine. It's not treats. The sixth practice is is a measured amount you take. That's why the bowl is considered to be one of the measuring devices. So if you've seen monks with bowls, right? And the bowl then is if you're going to do this practice, you get a bowl that is the measured amount you want to eat, and then you don't eat anymore. Now, of course, you've seen there's bowls, and then there's bowls. There's bowls like this, and there's bowls like this, and there's bowls like this. So the measured bowl is not the humongous one. Now, the humongous one does have a purpose, and it's not like for your stomach. It's because sometimes when you do alms rounds, you come back and share it in the monastery with those who can't go out on alms rounds. So that's why you would have a bigger bowl. But even then, if you're back in the monastery, you eat in a regular sized bowl. And you try to keep it regular. You try to keep the amount regular that you're eating. It sounds so simple, but it's not. Knowing when to stop is really tricky. But that's what it's about. I can remember we had bowls like about that size, actually about the size of your stomach. Then someone donated bigger bowls, and there was a lot of trouble. Because it's just like I'm sorry to put down Costco, but the shopping cart at Costco, you know, it's like, gee, I hardly have anything yet, you know. And so you go out and you fill it, and it's way beyond what you need. If you had a smaller shopping cart, you'd probably be better off, but they're smart. Also, they're smart because they put the really yummy things right at the checkout point. When you ever notice that in a grocery store, you go and you just got enough, and then the chocolate bars and the candies are all sort of while you're waiting in line. So quickly, if your cart isn't full, you can fill it up. So this training is really interesting. I remember one monk broke his bowl. He had a bowl, and he was going to do it measured, but then what he tried to do is he packed the food in. So he'd take the bowl, instead of loosely, you know, if we had rice or potatoes, they'd get squashed down to the bottom, and then the next layer would go in, compression, compression, compression. Until finally, I remember that one time, and then there was dessert, and he had figured out, oh my God, there's dessert, and I forgot dessert. So he took these yummy cakes, and the bowl cracked. So anyhow, that's kind of this back and forth you do. No food after a certain time. This is usually midday, so that's the seventh practice. Aranya, dwelling in a peaceful place. So you don't hang out in a village or even a noisy temple. As you know, some monasteries and temples are very quiet, but others, I mean, I've been to monasteries and temples, basically it's like the market. It's just constant noise and activity going on. Incense smoke, people coming in making offerings, the kids running around, bang, bang, boom, boom. And so it's actually quite a noisy place. So Aranya, the seeking of Aranya, is usually a quiet place like Redwood Vihara would be an Aranya, away from the major large temples. The ninth one is to dwell underneath a tree, so you not have a roof over your head. And that's why these are the wandering Dutong practices involve simple carrying robes, usually an umbrella and maybe a mosquito net and your bowl, and then you wander and you stay under a tree. Again, you could see the environmental relationship between trees and forests that we talked about earlier and these practices, because these trees then turn out to be a place of refuge and reliance. And then forests can also be places that offer shelter from wind and rain and storm. The next 10th practice, though, is you dwell in the open. You don't dwell underneath a tree. This is much more difficult to do. If you've ever been backpacking or whatnot, if you don't have a tent, you try to find some place where there's a little overhead shelter, but to dwell right in the open really exposes you. And this is an advanced practice, and it's done to sort of expand the sense of the body and the body's dimensions, so that you're letting go a little bit of the comfort zone. But again, this is not recommended for everybody, and it's only in certain areas. This is very hard to pull off, say in Antarctica. You know, you just 3 robes and you're dwelling in the open, you're not going to last the night. So you have to measure this in accordance with the conditions. The 11th practice is very difficult and only recommended by the teacher for the student at a certain stage of his or her development, which is dwelling in a cemetery or a graveyard, sometimes called a charnel ground. Charnel ground is different than our cemeteries here. Charnel ground is where the body parts and usually are open and exposed to nature, so that the animals, birds, and whatnot can take them apart and recycle them. So this takes a great deal of advanced practice and understanding and self-control and overcoming a certain amount of attachments and fears and so forth in order to do this. If done at the right time, it can propel, because it's a visceral awareness of the impermanence of the body and death. And you can see at that moment, there will be me at some point. And so it can help at that. On the other hand, if you're not ready for this, it can be traumatic and shocking and set you back. so you have to be careful. Sometimes in some countries, this is done by getting permission to go and be in autopsies that are performed at hospitals, so that you can experience it that way, because maybe there aren't any cemeteries that are wide open anymore. But the same purpose is in doing this. I mentioned I was participating in that triple bypass surgery of a doctor friend of mine, and that was another experience along those lines, to be there in an operating room and see that exposed body. And the last one is never lying down, so to sleep. So you're sitting in the sitting meditation posture as you sleep in the night. This was both voluntary and involuntary for me. It was voluntary in that I took it up and nobody forced me to do it. It was involuntary in the sense that prior to this I was sleeping in a sleeping bag. This was on the pilgrimage. But then when all the sleeping bag and everything was stolen, all that was left for each of us was one of those small wool army blankets. And I quickly discovered the quickest way to stay warm was to sit upright and wrap the blanket around, because if I lied down, the blanket was always all over the place and I'd get cold. So I ended up doing the 13th Dhutanga practice involuntarily, because it was the only way to stay warm at night. I guess that's not bad motive, but it's not the elevated motive either. This thing about never being weary, here it's actually, Master Hua translates or interprets this as not getting out of sorts and irritated. So it's a kind of restless fatigue with your practice or your exercises. And it basically says you don't get all kind of grumpy and Oscar the Grouch over your cultivation. Oh, I gotta go sit again. Yeah, gotta go to retreat. You kind of have a joy about what you're doing. It also means, Master Hua says, you're not lazy. And another meaning is you don't retreat. So the fatigue doesn't mean you don't rest. You rest because you need to rest when it's appropriate. But you don't change your heart and your mind and your course. You're really steadfast in that. And you find a way to take delight and joy in your practices. This is really important. This cannot be sustained. These kind of practices cannot be sustained if they're lifeless and joyless. It just doesn't work. So somehow you have to adjust your practices to get that return of joy. They recite this, a sort of dhyana bliss you take. And if that's not there, your practice will sour, you'll meet obstacles and impediments, and then you'll share them with others. You'll start to transfer them. So it's really important to find that joy. I don't mean like high rush. That's not what I'm talking about, but a general, just solid contentment and joy with doing this. It says here the lion's roar, which is a common expression for when the Buddha speaks the teachings, but there's also a physical quality to someone who's cultivated in this way, that they actually do generate a sound that is moving. It's not just chatterbox sound. And it gets your attention. So when the lion roars in the jungle, attention is focused. And so it has both the idea that it's delivering something solid and real, but it also is a sort of a wake-up call. Until I went backpacking in the Rockies and the Sierras, I had never really directly encountered wildcat. I mean, occasionally you'd see them in Wisconsin where I grew up, but very rarely. And if you saw them, it was usually at a distance. They were running away or escaping. I did see it on MGM when I watch movies. MGM comes, okay, so, turn on the volume or whatnot. It's just, it's like a teddy bear. But I can remember my first time when encountering a cougar in the Sierras, sort of between me and that first row there. I came around a corner and there it was, and it let out a roar. I can tell you, my hair stood on end, and I got a tingling, prickly feeling throughout my body, and it was like, All I had to defend myself with a Swiss Army knife. So the vulnerability of that, and it wasn't so much that he isn't aggressive, it was the roar itself that went right down to the heels that woke me up. Anyhow, the next passage goes on, living beings flow and turn in the sea of love and desire, covered over by the net of ignorance, and greatly worried and oppressed. The one of utmost humaneness and courage completely pulls them out, vowing that it will be this way is his practice. Vowing that it will be this way is his practice. This is very interesting that often emotional overwroughtness or hyper-emotionality or out-of-control emotions are represented often in water imagery, and this is the case here. They say the sea, turn and flow in the sea. When you look at it, one of the commentaries on this says, it is like the sea. If you've ever been to the ocean, how many people have swum in the ocean here? Anybody? 1, 2? There's some who haven't. If you want to get a feel for this, though, sometime when the water is not too nice, just go in the waves and the shore before you get to the white shark, just go in and just feel the energy of that ocean, those waves. It's very, very tumultuous. And the commentary says there's 5 reasons why it's hard to escape this. One, the sea can be very deep. And so if you've, but even lakes, some lakes can be very deep. So you go in, but then you drop off. And there's this feeling, if you've ever been in a lake or ocean where you drop off, it's a little bit scary because you don't know where bottom is. And the strong emotions are represented with this. One, it's deep. The second one, the waves are swift. They really come and can pull and tear. The other thing that happens very commonly is a disorientation and confusion as you get tossed in the waves. Again, on the shores of California, you can get tossed and turned. And divers often talk about this too. They get so disoriented, they don't know where up and down is if you get turned in this way. The other is, this is from Sea Mariner's Tales, but it's really good. You're grabbed by creatures. So now, when I was swimming on the East Coast, I got grabbed by a, what was it? A little crab. Oh, come on. I was just a little kid, and the crab bit my, and that scared me. It's like I was used to my bathtub. I go in my bathtub, a little rubber ducky and whatnot. And this thing, all of a sudden, something I couldn't see grabbed me. And then later it was a, what do you call these floating, Jellyfish stung me. Whoa. Now that was something. I was like, pretty jellyfish, and wham. So this, but it's a metaphor for the creatures of lust and jealousy and anger, ecstasy and despair, fretting, fearing, infatuation, fever, hot, and then ice cold. These are what the creatures are. It's being talked about. So when you're in this swell of emotions, this goes on. There's ecstasy, there's agony, there's jealousy, there's fretting, there's hot, and then cold. And finally, the fifth thing is that in fighting this and working with this, you lose your strength. You tire out, and you succumb. This is where dust fatigue comes in, the idea of dust fatigue. So in flowing with the emotions, rather than the Dhutanga where I said energy is coming, from these, you're flowing out rather than gathering energy in. And so there's what I call the burnout flow. There's a burnout flow that at the end of the day or end of a shopping spree or an end of one of these, all-out debacle party sort of things, there's a depression almost, an emptiness and a fatigue. So this is one of the meanings of the sea of desires and so forth. Fourth one, I'm trying to move along. You can notice. Okay. We in the world are remiss and attached to the 5 desires. We make unreal discriminations and thereby receive a score of suffering. We should uphold and practice the Buddhist teachings and always gather in our minds, vowing to save all such as these is his practice. So on one hand, you have the Buddha making these observations of the lost and sort of deplorable state of living beings. And for us, we're talking about people. And yet, there's no weariness and there's no fatigue. There's no judgmentalism here. There's only I shall, I will, I'll go rescue, I'll save. It's very therapeutic. It's almost like a good doctor. It doesn't say it's hopeless, it's helpless, or I look down on these people for being lost in this way. It's a very compassionate regard. Remiss is a very interesting word here. It means actually reckless and careless. And this is an interesting idea. It doesn't mean just I forgot. It means you're excessively reckless and careless about what you're doing. You're not attentive and you're not attending. So this remiss isn't just a lapse. It's an actual sort of negligence. It's close to what we get into when we consider some crimes as being negligently done, rather than, they're not fully intentional, but there is an intentionality because you've not paid attention to what you should be. So there's a lapse in mindfulness. And then it says this very interesting line, we make unreal discriminations. This one really struck me. Do you remember previous weeks we did prapancha and discriminations, phobia and whatnot? So this again is bringing up that theme of the proliferation of images and wrong thinking that sometimes is called the blizzard when you sit down in meditation and all of a sudden these unreal proliferation of thoughts and feelings and emotions just come up. That's called prapancha. It's the wild, mad mind working. So here, they use unreal discriminations to stress the fact that these have no substance of their own. These are figments of our active imagination, of consciousness. Other words you could use is infatuations or fantasies. But one of the things that occurred to me when I was looking at this today, it resonates with some work in Western sociology and psychology that has to do with the idea of fetish. I don't know if you've ever heard this idea, fetish, F-E-T-I-S-H, but it's an object of irrational reverence and obsessive devotion. So to have a fetish for something is as you have this obsessive, irrational reverence, devotion for something. It could be an icon or image. It could be another person. It could be a thing. And it's not necessarily religious. It could be a car, a computer, a piece of jewelry. But it's irrational, obsessive because you think it has magical almost power to deliver something special to you, that you can't live or survive without it, that it imbues you with, for want of a better word, magical power. Now the sociologists who are working this came up with the idea they call commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism. So sometimes it's looked at as the object of worship of people, their statues or their beads or a particular piece of jade or something that they just attach to in that way. But the sociologists talk about it as commodity fetishism. In other words, rather than religious objects, we've now developed this fetish for material objects. And so we almost rapaciously go after these objects, feeling that we're not whole or complete unless we get them. And the funny thing about this fetish is we get one in commodity fetish, but it never really satisfies. And so this becomes a bottomless pit. We go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, getting more but feeling less filled. It's a really funny thing. And one of the sociologists called it the religion of sensuous appetite. Commodity fetish, the religion. So they're calling it a religion in the sense that it's almost blind devotion to these material objects, giving them almost divine power over us. So the religion of sensuous appetites. And then they say the fantasy of the appetites tricks the fetish worshiper into believing that an inanimate object will yield its natural character to gratify whatever the desires of the worshiper, consumer are. This is pretty interesting. So we're taking unreal discriminations here from the text, which is talking about prapancha, but when you apply it over to the realm where most of us live, It's this worshiping fetishism over commodities and objects that actually, from the anthropologist's point of view, makes us look like we're worshiping money or what money can buy. We're not worshiping deities or icons or images, which we say, oh, that's superstition. Look at that. The primitive, yeah, there's some movie on last night and showing the primitive peoples beating their drums and worshiping these icons, you know, and it's like the scientists, oh my, superstition. But if you were an anthropologist from another country and you came to America, you go, oh my God, look at that. They're worshiping money and cars and computers and cameras. Whoa, these aren't even deities. Okay, just a side thought. I said I'd do a journal story, didn't I, tonight? Okay, I'm going to shoot ahead. Next week, I'm going to come back to number 4 because that should take a little more time. They become attached to a self and enter birth and death. They seek its boundaries but cannot obtain it. We should wholeheartedly serve the thus come one and attain the wonderful Dharma. Expounding to others is his practice. I want to spend some time on this next week because there's a great deal of misunderstanding regarding no self. And not just among, people who aren't exposed to the Dharma. Even among people who are exposed to the Dharma, there's a lot of misunderstanding about self and no self. Anybody know the technical term for that? Anatta, or anatman. So anatta is no self, anatman, no self. The problem with this is it's one of those key terms in Dharma that's meant to be profoundly illuminating and liberating, and instead when we hear it, it creates this negative reaction of the denial of the person, the radical denial of existence. When Carl Jung first came upon this teaching, he said, oh my gosh, this is a radical denial of life, of existence. Once he really understood it, he thought, this is actually very close to what I've been working on with the true self. So, but I want to not just rush through this because I think maybe it's worth spending some time on and going into that. So the passage I was looking at tonight to illustrate is really the 6th verse, and then I will come back to 4 and 5 next week. Now, isn't that tricky? So we're moving right ahead. We're on number 6, but then next week we're going back to 4 or 5. So, sorry. None of you were fooled by that trick. This story I wanted to share with you tonight. Yeah. Now the thing about this journal, when I go back to it, is my penmanship back, this is 1976, 1977. Some of you weren't even born there. Is somebody here, is everybody here born after 70? When were you born? 91? Does your mother know you're here? I'm sorry. Okay, so this was 76, 20 years almost before you were born. My penmanship is much clearer, but I was practicing frugality, and so I wrote really small. So I'm going to have to, or my eyes have gotten diminished from time. So I want to share this, but it has to do with the 6th passage. Living beings are confused and deluded and lose the proper path. By constantly walking on crooked paths, they enter dark places. For their sakes, the lamp of proper Dharma is lit. Eternally being a brilliant illumination is his practice. I love that line. Eternally being a brilliant light is his practice. Nothing else but just lighting up one's mind, lighting up one's nature, and then just letting it shine. So, the story I told you earlier was about the little girl who lit up when we had gas to give her so she and her father could make it. So this is on the dark side, matching this verse, and I'll try to read it. This is San Gregorio Pass. Some of you know the coastline, know where San Gregorio is. There is a pass. It's early morning, cold and quiet, and we start to climb up the pass. Mid-morning, reach a narrow straits with steep cliffs, shale and sandstone on each side, and the chilly winds rip through. It's really quite cold. It's a majestic vista to see. At the same time, it's also foreboding. Ahead, a long winding road to San Francisco. Behind, white waves wash on the shoreline of 60 miles on the Cabrillo Highway where we were at the time for 2 months bowing. So we're up here, I can look back and see back quite a ways with the white waves on the shore of the Cabrillo Highway that we bowed. Here we're at this juncture going over San Gregorio Pass. On the other side, we'll be going down into the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, a big, heavy, strange-looking man comes up. He's driving a beat-up blue station wagon, and it screams down on me fast, as unpredictable as the wind I ride. So he gets out of the wagon, comes to a halt, and just as like that strong wind is coming down on me. He's disheveled, very unsightly, drooling brown stains from his corner of his mouth, dribble down his lips. He's got shifting and disturbed eyes. His body looks like a big water balloon. And slushing all akimbo, I wrote. And it is like, oh, you're getting the imagery here. I'm just reading literally from what I wrote. To me, and I use this because I worked in a mental hospital for a number of years, and also was in martial arts and played sports. So you learn to size up people. So my size up is he's 6'7", 290 pounds. He presses me to the edge of the road. There's no place to go. Feel like I'm in a vice. Then he says, "You guys want to ride?" I said, no, we're making a Bowie pilgrimage. He says, "I know. I've been in lots of monasteries before." And he leers at me and then lunges at me from my blind side and tries to grab me. Fast as a weasel, deceptive. He looked like he was slow and lumbering. He wasn't, he was quick. And for a big awkward size, very nimble. And kind of belies his bulky appearance. I can't see him now, but I feel him coming down on me from behind. The shadow, his shadow, blocks out the sun completely and engulfs me. So I'm there, and the sun, all of a sudden, this shadow from behind eclipses the sun from behind, and all I see is darkness and shadow. That matching the verse here, I think, dark places. I take a giant step, dodging, and he then misses me and stumbles. I can hear and feel his heavy breath exhale as he prepares for another lunge, and now I'm trapped against the cliff. I don't have any place to go. Suddenly he halts and backs up, and he says to himself, okay, as if he's talking to someone. But I'm alone. Heng Sure is way up ahead over the pass already. The gusting winds put Heng Sure out of reach of me. So even if I wanted to call to Heng Sure, for help, the gusting winds would just blow the sound away, out of hearing range. The man stopped by something, not by me, something invisible to me, but very real to him. And he says, okay. And he backtracks to his car, as if for begging for mercy. And he starts to leave. And then he says, okay, leave the monks alone. Okay, leave the monks alone. Got it. So this line of constantly in deviant paths enter dark places, some light came and countered him. The passages in the Avatamsaka I put for this one are All demons in outside ways are unable to harm or injure them. They gather in and uphold the proper Dharma without cease. When they proclaim Dharma in all worlds, heavenly kings, dragons, yakshas, gandharvas, asuras, Garuda kings, Kanaras, all these different beings, all completely guard and protect them. So the reason I share this with you is, one, to sort of maybe illustrate the dark thing here, but also what I didn't say was Master Hua, in giving us instructions, said if you hold the precepts and you do your job and you reduce your false thinking, and you do your ceremonies and everything on time, you're really sincere, these strange beings and creatures will come to test you, but they'll have no way to get at you. You'll be protected in this way. But then he particularly stressed mantras. So I didn't mention in the journal at that time, I was reciting one line from the Shurangama mantra that the master had given to be used in situations like that. Now, whether it worked or not, obviously I'm still here, he didn't get me. And obviously he backed up hearing something. So whether that was Dharma protectors or whether that was a combination of that and the mantra line, I'm not sure. But the takeaway is there's a light, and this, we read this again, this light chapter, light enlightenment and so forth. It doesn't necessarily have to talk about the Buddha's light, it can talk about your own light. If you have a clear conscience and you're really trying to be a good person, there's a light. It radiates and it can be felt. So anyway, I should answer the question. Locke gave me a question from online, and then we'll close for tonight. The question was, what is the first step in changing oneself? Anybody want to? That's the question. Came from online. Anybody want to try it? Going once. What is the first step in changing oneself? Because last time I don't know how this came up, but it's saying we're always changing. Okay, so there's no time we're not in change. But there's being changed and changing yourself. Being changed is the process of karma just working on us, and we're just going through getting old, sick, and dying. And also changing in the sense of just being swept around by conditions. Changing oneself isn't actually intentional. So the question is, what is the first step in changing oneself? That's what the questioner was asking. Yeah?
Self-reflection.
Self-reflection, okay. Being mindful. Same or related? To his self-reflection, being mindful?
I think so.
Yeah, sort of. Self-reflection can have to do with looking. Mindful can include one, but also the whole situation. So it could include mindfulness of psychological, social, even the natural world. Yes?
Verhoeven Sure said you can only make a change if you really want to.
You're going to have to speak a lot louder. You can only change what?
You can only change if you really want to.
Okay. Anybody else? Honesty. Ooh, that's a good one. Almost a bitter, sweet, brutal honesty is required. Yeah. I would have started. What? Did I hear somebody? Oh. Well, I did this. I hear somebody? For me, my first answer was a willingness to change. And without that willingness, then reflection, mindfulness, none of that's going to kick in unless there's a willingness to actually change. You remember in the Lotus Sutra, before the Buddha actually spoke the Dharma he was going to speak, there was an indication that he was going to speak something radically new and different than what everybody had been accustomed to. And even Shariputra at that point says, oh, I don't know, this is kind of scary. This is not what I was hoping, expecting. I thought I'd already arrived. And the Buddha's saying, oh, you're not quite there. But before the Buddha actually spoke, 5,000 walked out. And the description in the text was they were not willing to learn. They were not willing to change. So the willingness to change has to be the first thing. The opposite of that willingness is sometimes presented as arrogance or pride. In other words, you're so full, there's no room to put anything. So bowing is often a preparatory exercise for change because it's indicating a willingness to soften the heart, to repent, to open up. But bowing can be also done just to impress everybody else or to solicit divine favor. So it's not done for a willingness to change, but almost like a solicitation for a return. So in that way, bowing doesn't work as far as the first step for change. The other thing I would say, with, at least for me, is even though there's a willingness, there has to be a way. Because once I see or find my deepest faults and shortcomings, they're already hardened and habituated. They're really strong. And even though there's a willingness to change them, without some method, it ain't going to happen because they're going to stubbornly hold on. So that's why I think the texts are very clear that Shila, not S-I-L-A, Shila, the precepts, are the most important aspect. For once the willingness is there, the mindfulness will come if Shila creates a space of clarity where you're not harming yourself or others. So with no killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, intoxicants, or deception, you've created a space after the willingness for things to appear as they are. But with precepts not in place, the habituation just continues. So like, that's why it says the precepts drive the root of Bodhi deep, the root of awakening deep. So there has to be a willingness and then an actual commitment to holding and keeping precepts at the very beginning. And then you can probably start to use mindfulness and reflection as a positive. Anyhow, that's a quick answer to a good question. Anything else? Wait, anybody else have questions?
What was the mantra line you recited?
Why haven't I changed, you ask? Because my attachments are not attachments, they're virtuous qualities. No, I'm joking. What was the question? The line I cited?
The Shurangama line you recited.
Oh, what was the line I recited? Well, actually, I have to think about whether I'm entitled to do that kind of thing. What I will say, though, is if you hold the precepts, and if you're willing to change, Han Shan De Ching talks about this. The use of mantras is an invaluable tool to have at your disposal without any specific thing to do. Memorize the Great Compassion Mantra. Memorize the Shurangama Mantra. And then in situations where you find yourself fatigued or weary or uncertain, you recite this and you'd be surprised what it can do. This was my experience on the pilgrimage. It works. They do work. You don't even have to use specific lines. If you recite it every day, you envelop yourself with Dharma protecting spirits. It's just like an entourage. And if you recite it in specific situations, the whole thing, it has that salutary, positive, protective effect. And even if you don't have that situation, if you do it with the mind that I'm going to radiate this mantra as a light, be a bright light, and just let it go out, a compassionate mantra regard. You don't have to speak Dharma. This will have an effect. Being brought up as a child of science in the 50s and early 60s, I initially did not buy into and accept this. A number of instances like this on the pilgrimage and in travels throughout Asia and so forth over time have convinced me that this is absolutely right on. It does work. It's real. That's just my conclusion at this point. Whether you think that or not, it's completely up to you. If you think, okay, I'll memorize them. Okay, you don't believe in them? Fine. You've just stopped false thinking for the amount of time it takes to memorize them. So just see it as a stopgap. For the time you're memorizing, you're not thinking about killing and greed and all that sort of thing. And then I would say try it out. Just see. See if you don't feel different after memorizing these and using them. See if they don't have a salutary effect on the vibes in your life and whatnot. And if not, then don't do it. But it's something to take up and experiment and work with. I've even gotten to the point where in my sleep, if I'm having nightmares that usually are associated with these states that can come, I will reflexively recite the mantra in my sleep. And invariably, it turns it. And I never wake up. It's just happening in my dream sleep. So memorizing sutras and memorizing mantras and like this is very interesting psychological stuff that's going on at a realm that some of us are very attuned to. I say this as maybe you're skeptic, but there's a lot of people who aren't skeptic at all. They really understand and use this. Other people may be a little skeptical, and I would say try it and see what you think. And if you're totally against it, don't do it, because it's not meant to be forced. But there are, what do they say in Shakespeare's Hamlet? There are more things to heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy, Horatio. And this is Hamlet's response to Horatio, who doubts the world of ghosts and spirits that Hamlet is reporting. And even though that's a long time ago said, I still think there are many things to heaven and earth that are dreamed up in our natural sciences as well. So anyway, just sharing with you. Yes?
How do you recite in the dream? Like, you mentioned you had bad dreams, right? And you said you recite in the dream. How do you?
I recite in the dream.
Because I do have bad dreams.
Yeah.
My wife taught me to recite like that. I don't know how to do that. And I just wake up from the bad dreams.
Oh, well, waking up is good. Literally waking up, but waking up within the dream is good too. But it came from memorization. So once it's memorized, it's just like martial arts in a sense. You study martial arts for a long time, and then just naturally, this is your move. You don't even think about it. It's reflexive because it's in your system. You know, think, here's somebody going to punch me. Let's see, what am I supposed to do? I should, bang, you're flat. So by conditioning yourself in this way, you develop a second nature. So holding precepts starts with, oh, I should, I shouldn't, I should, I shouldn't. Pretty soon it's just natural. It's just so natural to you, you wouldn't even have the motivation after they've internalized that way. Reciting mantras and texts like this is the same way. It just sort of comes spontaneously. So you have to practice this in terms of the memorization and get it down. Then, even when your guard is down sort of in the sleep state, this Dharma mind, this Dharma activity is still active. It can still be called up. And in fact, in some ways it works better at that realm than at the conscious realm. So that's one of the things people don't understand, why there's memorization in this tradition. It's not just to preserve the text and pass them on. It's to actually internalize it in a very deep psychic, profound way so that it's in your system. I'm using metaphors here. Just as soon as you've had a diet for a number of years and you start to see the effects of that diet over time, the same is true of this. In traditional practice, memorizing the sutras wasn't the end point, it was just the beginning point of entry point to understand the sutra. And so in the East Asian tradition, the memorization was a key part of the training. So these Dhutanga practices I mentioned tonight, well, that's one part of the training, but memorization was as well. And it wasn't just, an idle mind is the devil's playground sort of thing, so you should memorize. The memorization was done as actually restructuring your internal archaeology, your genetic makeup was being restructured by these sounds, these images, these ideas going in. It was like a diet, and you became a different person as a result of this. We tend to think of, well, I'm going to figure it out with my head analytically, philosophically. That's only the superficial layer, because where most of our activity is coming from is not from philosophy or thought, it's coming from emotions and feelings, and this deep world where Dharma penetrates. That's where this goes, where imagery and icons and mantras and so forth work. That's the real landscape of our mind. And to not use these tools when they're available to us is really to go in short-handed and not equipped. Hanshan says, well, you can use thought, you can use analysis, you can do a number of things, but at some point he says you're going to get where only mantras are able to work. And then you use them there. And when you're done, you leave them and don't use them again, don't get attached to them. But the tools for human understanding and expanding and rectifying human consciousness that are coming out of this tradition are manifold. That's why you have 5 different schools: Chan, Pure Land, Vinaya school, mantra, what's called esoteric school, and study. All 5 of them work on human consciousness to refine it. So I would encourage you, start out with memorizing some of these mantras and then commit to memory one of the texts. The easiest one is the Heart Sutra. Start with the Heart Sutra. Now, I can't do the Heart Sutra. I can't do the small mantras. I can't even do Om Mani Padme Hum. Okay, then remember the story, sweep clean. Sweep clean the disciple. That's all he could remember is sweep clean, sweep clean. And he swept and swept. And he'd just say, sweep clean, sweep clean, sweep clean. And he attained the first stage of arhatship because his mind was so focused on that one thing with no other thoughts coming in, it actually worked. So it depends. Some of you are so smart that you can do 3 mantras simultaneously and still false think. I can multitask. So I'm reciting the Avatamsaka, I'm reciting the Shravangam, I'm doing the mantras, and I'm still thinking food, fame, wealth, sex, sleep. Okay, well, just up it again. Recite them backwards. Whatever you have to do to stop the mad mind. But that's not all that's going on here. It is a mind stopping, it's an interrupting of consciousness, yes. But there's also something going on with these mantras that have to do with not just an interruption, but an efficacious working of realms and worlds that we are in all the time, but we're not always conscious of them. So we think, oh, I determine my destiny and everything. Yeah, well, that's only partially true. Even Freud would recognize that's not completely true. And at a much deeper level, it's even less true. So you use all these things at your disposal. It's really pretty cool. Oh, quickie. We're out of time almost. Yeah, save it for next week. Okay.
It's like the same topic, so
Well, I just said we're going back to 4 and 5 after doing 6, so you can go back to the same topic next week. Unless, of course, it's gone by next week. And if it's a heavy question that's gone by next week, you'll have to let me know how you did it. Okay, so the monks are not here tonight, right? But they did get over their COVID, I heard. So we'll do the transference in English, and I think everybody will be back next week. Tomorrow night, Heng Sure will be lecturing on the Avatamsaka. Any other announcements, Luke, that things happening? One of the monks will be back tomorrow. Okay. Is there any event happening here? No Dharma assembly or anything? Okay. So just tomorrow night lecture, and then always you can go to the website, I guess. I don't know how to get there, but you can go there and figure it out. Let's transfer. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands minds and hearts can find in giving unity. May our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the triple jewel.